Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
We've got some really fascinating source material in front of us today. It's excerpts from a text on Western political thought, and we're zooming right in on the era of modern liberalism.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive really is to plunge into what was a truly pivotal period. A time when thinkers were seriously grappling with let's say, the uncomfortable side effects of democracy taking hold, and also the huge changes from the industrial age.
Exactly. So the big question we're tackling, the core question is, how did these major liberal thinkers face up to democracy's potential downsides? Especially the fear. And it's a fear some still have today, isn't it?
Yeah.
That democracy itself might actually threaten individual liberty.
Right. And how did their ideas, their foundational concepts about freedom, society, government, how did they have to, well, twist and change in response to these new pressures?
Precisely. We're peeling back the layers here, not just on abstract theories, but, how these ideas were really forged in the heat of real-world changes, and how they then went on to reshape Western thought.
And we're going to be spending quite a bit of time with three absolute heavyweights: Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, and T.H. Green.
Yeah, giants in the field. And we'll look at the specific challenges, quite surprising, actually, that they saw within the liberal project itself.
Our goal really is to pull out the key insights, the most important nuggets from these texts for you, the listener. So by the end of this deep dive, you should have a really clear grasp of these foundational ideas.
Why they were so revolutionary, maybe even controversial, when they first came out.
Exactly. And why they still spark such intense debate today. And crucially, how they've shaped the political world we all live in now. It's about, cutting through the noise, getting past the jargon, and finding those aha moments in these, frankly, sometimes dense but vital texts.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Let's unpack the world of Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, many people will know him as the French aristocrat, right? Came over to the U.S. in 1831, supposedly to study the prison system. That was the official reason.
Right. Yeah, the official cover story almost. But his observations, they went way, way beyond just penal reform.
Absolutely. What he ended up writing, published a few years later as Democracy in America, it became an instant classic, recognized almost immediately, and certainly today, as this foundational study of, the whole structure of democracy, sociologically, politically.
It really is the benchmark, isn't it? Pretty much every analysis of American democracy since, and maybe democracy anywhere, kind of has to reckon with Tocqueville.
And what's just so remarkable, almost audacious, about his work is his central thesis. He looks around at the world, his world, and basically declares that the spread of democracy isn't just some passing fad.
No. He saw it as, unstoppable, almost divinely guided, you could say, a providential fact. That's his famous phrase.
Providential fact, yeah.
He believed all the big movements he was seeing, social, economic, political, were just pushing relentlessly towards more equality, more democracy, and that there really weren't any forces strong enough to stop its inexorable triumph.
He literally said trying to stop it was futile, to resist the will of God. Imagine that.
Yeah.
A French aristocrat saying the age of aristocracy is basically done. You might as well get used to it.
And the historical context here is just so crucial for understanding where he's coming from, isn't it?
Absolutely.
He's writing, in the shadow of the French Revolution, the violence, the excesses, and also amidst these efforts across Europe to try and put the genie back in the bottle, restore the old monarchies, the old order.
Right.
And Tocqueville just completely reframes the whole debate. For those conservatives clinging to the past, his message was blunt. Look, the future is democratic. Get over it.
Yeah.
So the real question isn't if democracy is coming, but how are we going to handle it? How can societies adapt and maybe reform democracy to manage its built-in tendencies?
But, and this is key, his analysis wasn't just a memo to the conservatives. It was a really profound, almost alarming warning to the liberals, too. While he's saying, yes, democracy is inevitable, he then meticulously details its potential fatal flaw. This powerful inherent tendency to slide into a tyranny of the majority.
He argued this tendency was so strong, so rooted in the very nature of democratic society that it could, if you weren't careful, make the whole idea of liberal democracy a kind of, a tragic contradiction.
A contradiction in terms, yeah.
Yeah.
The source text actually highlights this, how he suggested that just expanding voting rights, the franchise, without tackling these deeper issues, it might actually make the problem worse, not better.
And Tocqueville really drills down to find the root cause of this potential tyranny. He finds it in this overwhelming, relentless desire for equality that he sees in democratic peoples.
Right.
This desire, he argues, if you push it to its logical extreme, fundamentally undermines, even destroys, liberty.
Why? How does that work?
Well, because equality, in the way he's talking about it here, stresses sameness,
Huh?
uniformity, the idea that everyone should be alike, have similar circumstances, think the same thoughts. Liberty, on the other hand, is all about difference, right? Individual distinctiveness.
Mm-hmm.
The freedom to be different, to think differently, live differently. If that drive for sameness becomes absolute, where does liberty go? It just evaporates.
So this intense focus on equality,
Yeah.
what does it really mean for society?
Hmm.
Tocqueville saw it as deeply tangled up in the democratic impulse itself.
Mhm.
I mean, democracy implies political equality, one person, one vote.
Mm-hmm.
And because these liberal democratic revolutions were reactions against the old aristocratic systems, which were incredibly unequal,
Right. Deeply unequal.
the fight against aristocracy sort of supercharged the ideal of equality, maybe pushed it to an extreme where equality could become the ultimate value, the supreme goal, even overshadowing liberty itself.
Now, he's not saying democratic people don't care about liberty at all. He acknowledges they have a natural liking for it.
Okay.
But, and this is his crucial, maybe most controversial point, he observed that liberty is not the chief and constant object of their desires. Equality is their idol, and they would rather perish than lose it.
Wow. Equality is their idol. That suggests a definite hierarchy, doesn't it? Where equality tends to win out if it comes into conflict with liberty.
That's the implication. And he argued this drive for equality is dangerously pervasive. It doesn't just stay neatly in the political box of voting rights.
No.
No, it spills over everywhere, into social life, economic hopes, even cultural attitudes. The powerful tendency is to want to level all distinctions, to treat everyone and everything as basically the same, even applying this principle to things like, intellectual ability or artistic taste.
Treating intellectual merit the same as anything else, that raises a big question, doesn't it? What happens to dissenting opinions, to people who think differently in a society obsessed with sameness?
Exactly. Because the majority implicitly feels everyone should be alike, they tend to expect others to think just like them. And this creates enormous social pressure on minorities, especially intellectual minorities, to just conform.
Why conform? What's the pressure?
Because holding different opinions, expressing distinct thoughts, it implicitly violates that core principle of equality. It suggests you think your opinion, your way of seeing things, is different, maybe even better than the majority's view.
So it's not just disagreement, it's seen as a kind of social challenge, a violation of the norm.
Precisely. And Tocqueville argues that this pervasive pressure, this overwhelming force of public opinion, is the real essence of majority tyranny in a democracy. Its power, he thought, was terrifying because it could tyrannize the mind, the spirit, even if you had constitutional rights protecting free speech.
So legal rights might not be enough.
He suggested they could become practically useless if people feel intense social pressure to just fall in line.
Yeah.
Or if they face being ostracized, socially shunned, if they refuse. Psychological pressure, he saw, is often all it takes.
He had that chilling line, didn't he? Something about fetters and headsmen being the old way.
Yes. Fetters and headsmen were the coarse instruments which tyranny formerly employed, but in democratic republics, the body is left free and the soul is enslaved.
The soul is enslaved. That's a really haunting image. But Tocqueville didn't stop there, did he? He saw an even deeper, maybe more disturbing potential outcome.
He did. He believed that if this tyranny of the majority wasn't vigorously checked, it could actually evolve into a new, perhaps even more insidious kind of despotism, one that ends up enslaving not just the minorities, but the majority itself.
How could that happen?
Well, he painted this picture in a very famous passage, one that many people read today and find remarkably prophetic. He describes this innumerable multitude of men, all equal and alike.
Okay.
And what are they doing? They're consumed by pursuing petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. And crucially, they're isolated from each other, strangers, existing, he says, but in himself and for himself alone.
So disconnected, cut off from community, from country.
Yeah, their connections weaken, dissolve. They retreat into their own little private bubbles of consumption and enjoyment.
And overseeing this huge crowd.
Above them stands an immense and tutelary power. He describes its nature very carefully. Its absolute total control. Minute concerns itself with the tiniest details of life. Regular and provident plans, and manages everything systematically. And, importantly, it's mild.
Mild. How can it be absolute and mild?
It acts like a parent, a guardian. But its goal isn't to prepare people for adulthood or self-government. Instead, it seeks to keep them in perpetual childhood. It's happy for people to rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing.
So it wants them happy but passive.
Exactly. This benevolent power is eager to ensure their happiness. It provides security, anticipates their needs, facilitates their pleasures, manages their main concerns, directs their industries, even regulates inheritance and property. In short, as Tocqueville put it spares them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living.
That description, I mean, it sounds remarkably, maybe uncomfortably, like the potential dark side of the modern bureaucratic welfare state, doesn't it?
It really does. And Tocqueville saw that this power becomes absolute precisely because it's mild and acts in the name of equality. People willingly, maybe even happily, grant government almost total power if they believe that power is being used benignly to ensure their comfort and contentment.
And the equality principle reinforces this.
Yes, because the driving value in democracy is equality, the principle says everyone has an equal right to this security and happiness, which makes the huge central power that guarantees it seem perfectly legitimate, even desirable.
It's worth just pausing there to connect this back. Tocqueville's immense and tutelary power. It sounds a bit like the kind of government that Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism might imply, doesn't it?
That's a really interesting point, yeah, where the state's job is basically to manipulate pleasure and pain to get the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Some scholars definitely argue Bentham's theory fits better with this kind of pervasive bureaucratic state Tocqueville warned about, rather than the minimal negative state of classical liberalism.
And Tocqueville noticed that the social conditions he described, these isolated individuals just chasing private pleasures, also kind of mirrored the utilitarian or classical liberal view of society as just, well, a collection of self-interested individuals.
That image he paints, the innumerable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures. It does sound a bit like Bentham's ideal citizen, just spread across the whole society.
And this led Tocqueville to a really crucial, kind of counterintuitive discovery, didn't it? A link between liberal individualism and this potential for bureaucratic despotism.
Yes, a deep connection. He argued that the more individuals in a democracy focus solely on their own self-interest, their private satisfactions, the more intense their desire for equality actually becomes.
Why is that?
Because the logic of individualism in a democracy leads people naturally to think, my right to satisfy my desires should be equal to everyone else's. And ensuring this perceived equality of happiness seems to require a powerful central bureaucratic authority to manage things, distribute resources fairly.
So paradoxically, intense individualism doesn't necessarily lead to more liberty.
No. It could lead, Tocqueville feared, to a kind of happy and willing enslavement of the whole population to this immense benevolent bureaucratic power, all in the name of equality.
And he found another major consequence of this psychology, too.
Yes, equally significant. This individualistic focus doesn't just make people willing to submit to central power. It actively creates the social conditions where that kind of despotism can just flourish.
Oh, so?
Remember his description of democratic man living but in himself and for himself alone? And concerning others, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He's showing how this individualism isolates people.
Yeah.
They get so wrapped up in their own paltry pleasures, their private concerns, that they just fail to build real community, shared life with their fellow citizens.
And a consequence of that isolation.
It's profound. The groups, the associations, the communities that could act as checks on central power, they tend to wither away, disintegrate, which leaves the government free to expand its authority without meeting much resistance.
So it's another paradox. Emphasizing individualism leads to a decline in associational life.
Which in turn increases the power of the central bureaucracy over the now isolated individual. Pushed to its extreme, democratic society risks becoming a mass society, atomized individuals completely dependent on the central administrative state, lacking any collective power to push back.
This sounds a lot like Edmund Burke's critique of the French revolutionaries, doesn't it? Burke argued they destroyed all the traditional buffers, church, aristocracy, local groups.
Exactly. The very things that had historically checked state power. Tocqueville absolutely echoed this concern. He saw these intermediate associations as vital bulwarks, essential for preserving individual rights and preventing despotism.
Which is why he concluded so emphatically that there are no countries in which associations are more needed than those which are democratically constituted.
Precisely. He believed a pluralistic society, just teeming with diverse groups and associations operating independently from the state, was essential. A necessary defense against both centralized government power and the homogenizing force of majority opinion.
And he saw America, at least when he visited, as having this in spades, right? This incredibly rich associational life.
He did. He noted all the legal associations, townships, municipalities, counties that decentralized power and drew people into local government, acting as a check on the national level. He even suggested that even if a bad law was passed nationally, liberty would still be protected by the mode of executing that law because local people would be involved in carrying it out.
But even more important were the voluntary associations.
Yes, arguably more vital. Americans seem to form groups for everything: public safety, business, morality, religion, education, even just spontaneous groups to fix a local problem. He famously said this habit ran so deep you could see it even in kids' games.
And these groups weren't just about checking government power. They were also crucial for resisting the tyranny of public opinion.
Absolutely crucial. Tocqueville argued a key function was to provide members with a shared viewpoint, a source of moral support that could counterbalance the overwhelming pressure of wider public opinion. Think of a religious minority, for example. Within their congregation, they find affirmation, moral courage to stand against the dominant beliefs outside. Without that group support, the average individual, isolated by individualism, would likely lack the moral strength to publicly express dissenting views, even if they legally had the right.
So the associations provide a kind of psychological shield.
Exactly. Though he also noted an underlying cultural factor inherited from England that supported liberties like freedom of the press and religion, giving a foundation for these rights.
So Tocqueville's massive contribution wasn't just analyzing America. It was showing that a liberal democratic government isn't enough. You need a liberal democratic society to go with it.
Yeah, it's not enough to have the right constitution, the right laws on paper. You absolutely need the supportive social structures, the cultural attitudes that foster independence, association, resistance to conformity. That societal foundation was why he was, maybe cautiously, more optimistic about the U.S. than France at the time.
He felt France lacked that deep tradition of individual liberty, and its revolution had actually destroyed the traditional associations that could check power.
Right. His analysis made it crystal clear that the sort of strict rationalistic utilitarianism of people like Bentham and James Mill just wasn't enough. It was an inadequate philosophical basis for a healthy liberal democracy.
Because just expanding voting rights or creating legal democratic structures could, ironically, pave the way for the very problems he identified: majority tyranny, bureaucratic despotism.
Exactly, and this analysis created a really urgent need for liberal theory itself to undergo a pretty major revision.
Which brings us neatly to John Stuart Mill. Now, he was famously the son of James Mill, right? One of Bentham's closest allies, a key figure in that whole utilitarian circle.
That's right. It's often said, isn't it, that if he hadn't been practically force-fed utilitarianism by his father from birth,
Yeah, that intense education.
he might have rejected it completely. But the training was so relentless, so aimed at making him the perfect defender of the doctrine, that he could never quite bring himself to publicly repudiate it entirely.
But what's so interesting about Mill's journey is how he started to move away from that rigid utilitarianism, influenced by some unexpected sources.
Yeah, like the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, people who emphasized feeling, intuition, individuality over just cold, hard logic. Which, interestingly, has some echoes of Edmund Burke, focusing on those non-rational sides of human experience.
And Mill felt his own upbringing had been too focused on rationality, leaving him feeling emotionally underdeveloped.
Exactly. So this emphasis on the inner life, the development of the whole person, real resonated with him. It showed him the psychological gaps in utilitarianism.
And then he read Tocqueville.
Right. And just as the Romantics showed the psychological limits, Tocqueville showed the sociological ones. How that purely individualistic, pleasure-seeking model of society could paradoxically lead to conformity and centralized power.
So both influences pushed Mill towards a more nuanced view, emphasizing emotions, community, the limits of that purely rational, individualistic perspective.
A more, you could almost say, conservative perspective in some ways, while still remaining a liberal. It highlighted the need for a revised liberalism.
And what makes J.S. Mill so pivotal is that, unlike Tocqueville, who was mainly analyzing what he saw,
Right, diagnosing the problem.
Mill set out to actually revise liberalism's core philosophical assumptions. He tried to fix the underlying ideology. He thought the kind of reforms Tocqueville hinted at needed a deeper change in liberalism's premises, especially its reliance on utilitarianism.
Okay, so let's unpack how he started doing that. It begins in his work Utilitarianism, published in 1859. He starts off seemingly defending the greatest happiness principle, just like his dad would have wanted.
But then he throws a spanner in the works.
Almost immediately, he introduces a modification that, for many philosophers, just fundamentally blows up the original doctrine. He introduces the concept of quality alongside quantity of pleasure.
Quality of pleasure. How's that different from Bentham?
Well, for Bentham, remember, all pleasures were basically the same kind of thing, just differing in amount, intensity, duration, etc. You could measure them, add them up with his philosophic calculus.
Yeah.
Mill says, no, hold on. Some pleasures are qualitatively superior to others. They're inherently more valuable, regardless of how much intense, long-lasting lower pleasure you might get.
So you can't just add them up anymore.
Exactly. It makes Bentham's simple math impossible. It's like trying to add apples and, I don't know, profound philosophical insights. They're just different categories.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about the example Mill implies. Compare a life spent just chasing wealth and fleeting physical pleasures versus a life focused on, say, philosophical inquiry, art, or moral development. Mill argues forcefully that the intellectual and moral life yields pleasures that are qualitatively superior. No amount of money, no quantity of the lower pleasures it might buy can make it equal to the higher pleasure you get from understanding truth or acting virtuously.
So a struggling philosopher might actually be happier in a deeper sense than a super rich person focused only on money.
That's exactly Mill's argument. The philosopher experiences a kind of satisfaction that is inherently better, even if the rich person has more frequent or intense pleasures in the Benthamite sense.
Okay, but that raises a huge question. If you can't use Bentham's calculus, how do you know which pleasures are qualitatively superior? Who decides?
Ah, good question. Mill's answer relies on experience, but a specific kind. The test, he says, is the judgment of those best furnished with the means of comparison, meaning people who have actually experienced both the lower, sensual pleasures and the higher intellectual and moral ones. People with intellectual and moral training, capable of self-reflection, who can actually make that comparison fairly.
And this leads to his most famous, maybe most controversial statement on this.
Socrates quote, yeah. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied.
Right. And his reasoning is based on that experience test.
Exactly. Socrates, the philosopher, the dissatisfied human, has experienced both lower pleasures, what the pig or fool knows, and higher ones. So Socrates has the basis for comparison and chooses the higher, even with its potential dissatisfactions. The fool or the pig only knows one side, so their satisfaction doesn't carry the same weight. They lack the perspective to judge.
And here's where it loops back critically to Tocqueville's analysis, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The problem Mill saw, picking up on Tocqueville, is that in a democratic society obsessed with equality, most people, perhaps because their experience is limited to the lower pleasures, genuinely believe their judgment about happiness is just as good as anyone else's.
They uncritically accept the Benthamite idea. Pleasure is pleasure. Mine is as good as yours.
Right. They see their petty and paltry pleasures, as Tocqueville called them, as fundamentally equal to the higher satisfactions of a Socrates. And the democratic emphasis on equality reinforces this. If we're all politically equal, how can Socrates' opinion on happiness be superior?
And this widespread belief that all opinions are equally valid, regardless of experience or understanding, that's exactly what fuels the tyranny of majority opinion Tocqueville warned about.
Precisely. Mill saw, just like Tocqueville, that this tyranny wasn't just political. Pervasive public opinion could crush intellectual liberty, stifle the pursuit of higher needs, even if you had free speech laws on the books.
So Mill's critique of Benthamite utilitarianism is actually more radical than Tocqueville's analysis in a way, because it hits the philosophical foundation of classical liberalism itself.
You could argue that, yeah. If pleasures are qualitatively different, if some are inherently higher, maybe pleasure or happiness isn't even the right ultimate goal or measure for the best kind of life, like the life of virtue Socrates aimed for.
And that line of thought, it seems to have potentially anti-liberal, even anti-democratic implications, doesn't it? It sounds a bit like Plato saying only philosophers really know what's good and should rule.
It does have that flavor, suggesting not all opinions or lifestyles are equally valuable.
But Mill wasn't a Platonist, was he?
Yeah.
He didn't want philosopher kings or to get rid of democracy.
No, absolutely not. Like Tocqueville, he wanted to fix democracy, mitigate its flaws, not scrap it. He was still committed to ethical naturalism, no appeal to transcendent truths or natural law. Morality had to be grounded in human experience and well-being.
Okay, but Mill clearly thought justice was incredibly important, one of those higher qualitative goods. If it's not based on natural law, how do we know what justice is, or why it's superior?
That's a complex point in Mill. His answer is that values like justice are rooted in utility, but again, utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of a man as a progressive being.
Meaning utility that serves our long-term moral development.
Exactly. Basic human needs, like the incredibly strong desire for security, get transformed over time through social development into moral values like justice. They gain what he called a character of absoluteness. The sheer intensity and fundamental importance of these needs for human flourishing are what make the related values qualitatively superior.
And superior people, the Socrates types.
They understand justice means more than just personal security. They value it for its own sake, finding that higher Socratic happiness in the disinterested exercise of virtue.
So justice is higher because the feelings it addresses are so basic to our flourishing that the intensity becomes a qualitative difference. Still grounded in utility, but a refined, developed form of it.
That seems to be the core of his argument, and this philosophical groundwork leads straight into his most famous work, On Liberty, also 1859, same year as utilitarianism.
And On Liberty, like Tocqueville, argues passionately for liberty, especially freedom of opinion, against majority tyranny.
Passionately. But again, his basis isn't abstract natural rights or simple short-term pleasure. It's that utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being.
Liberty is the highest value because it's necessary for us to become these progressive beings.
Precisely. It's the absolute precondition for human development. Without freedom of opinion, without open debate, how can we figure out which values lead to higher pleasures? How do we discover better ways to live? The clash of ideas is essential for finding truth and advancing morally.
And On Liberty gives us those classic arguments for free expression, right?
The absolute classics. Even false opinions shouldn't be suppressed because arguing against them sharpens our understanding of the truth. If an opinion is partly true, debate helps sort the wheat from the chaff. And even if an opinion is completely true, it must be challenged. Otherwise, it becomes a dead dogma, just repeated without understanding, losing its real power.
So any attempt by the majority to shut down dissent hinders the search for truth and leads to what did he call it?
Progressive debasement of both the individual and the whole society.
And beyond free opinion, Mill also argued against too much government interference generally.
Yes, largely for pragmatic reasons tied to that idea of development. He believed giving individuals responsibility for their own choices and actions fosters self-reliance. Critical thinking, it's a means to their own mental education, as he put it. Too much state control stunts that growth.
And, echoing Tocqueville again, the more the government does,
the bigger the risk of creating that centralized, overbearing bureaucracy, that mild despotism Tocqueville warned about.
Okay, so pulling this together, Mill sees the flaws in democracy that Tocqueville pointed out that drift towards tyranny of opinion, conformity. But he still defends liberal democracy.
He does, because in theory, it provides the best conditions for that progressive moral and intellectual development he values so highly. It allows choice, expression, responsibility, things non-liberal systems deny.
But the practice of democracy, especially in mass society, pulls in the opposite direction, towards conformity and passivity.
Exactly. So the challenge was how to counteract those dangerous tendencies. Mill proposed safeguards. Either give elites more influence or, more importantly, raise the general level of the masses.
Giving elites influence. How?
In his considerations on representative government, he floated ideas like plural voting, giving more votes to the educated, or those in complex jobs and proportional representation to make sure intellectual minorities weren't totally swamped.
The idea being that decisions wouldn't just reflect raw public opinion, but would be informed by those who, supposedly, understood liberty and progress better.
That was the theory, to ensure the higher perspectives had a voice, to resist those illiberal majority tendencies.
He was pretty anti-democratic on the surface.
It does. But Mill saw it as mixing necessary aristocratic elements, drawing on thinkers like Aristotle into democracy to make it work properly, to stop it becoming just mobocracy.
But his main hope wasn't elite tinkering, it was raising the level of the masses.
That was the bigger goal. advocating for state-supported mass education, which was radical back then. Education was mostly for the rich or charity cases.
Though he was careful about the state controlling the content of education.
Very careful. He saw the danger of state indoctrination leading to even more uniformity. He wanted the state to provide access, not dictate thought.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and maybe a bit pessimistic. Mill himself saw that even mass education might backfire.
He did. Building directly on Tocqueville's observations about society making everyone more alike, Mill saw how modern life, improving communication, spreading literacy meant people increasingly read the same things, listen to the same things, see the same thing.
Leading inevitably to assimilation, a commonality of opinion.
Yeah. The tragic irony he foresaw was that the very tools meant to elevate the masses' education, communication could instead create a mass society dominated by a powerful, homogeneous mass public opinion.
And this destroys that variety of situations the diverse groups Tocqueville thought were so vital.
Exactly. The sameness of ideas kills off groups with different ideals. It's not just the state imposing uniformity, it's the very structure of mass education and communication promoting this potentially dangerous homogeneity.
So if elites couldn't easily be given special power, and even mass education might feed the problem, where did that leave liberalism? How could it prevent democracy sliding into despotism?
That's the critical challenge, and it's the problem that the next major figure in our deep dive, T.H. Green, tried to tackle by fundamentally reshaping liberal philosophy itself.
Okay, let's turn now to T.H. Green, an influential Oxford academic, the source tells us, who made the final break, not just from utilitarianism, but also from natural rights theory as the basis for liberalism.
Right. In doing that, he really laid the philosophical groundwork for what we now call modern liberalism. He wanted to move the tradition beyond what he saw as the narrow, overly individualistic, and psychologically thin doctrines of his predecessors.
And his philosophy drew heavily on German idealism. Hegel.
Yes, particularly Hegel. Green proposed this idea of a spiritual reality God, or universal reason, as the underlying rational and moral order of the universe.
Okay.
And for Green, human progress is about developing our ability to participate in that order by structuring our lives, our wills, around moral principles that we come to understand through reason. It's a kind of teleological development moving towards moral autonomy.
Moral autonomy meaning our will is determined by reason, not just impulse.
Exactly, determined by our understanding of the good. This idealist framework meant you couldn't justify liberal ideals just based on maximizing pleasure or satisfying individual desires anymore. They needed a richer grounding in human potential and moral purpose.
But what's interesting, while he uses Hegel, the source suggests his core ideas also resonate with much older traditions, back to Socrates, even Burke.
Yeah, it's a fascinating blend. The emphasis on reason, moral development, the importance of tradition and institutions.
Yeah.
You can see echoes of classical thought and even a kind of Burkean conservatism woven into his idealism.
So how did Green see human psychology differently from the utilitarians?
Radically differently. He completely rejected the idea that we're just driven by pleasure and pain. He argued, contrary to Hobbes and Bentham, that reason isn't just a tool to get what we desire. Reason actually determines what we desire in the first place. Our will is set by an object of his own making, our conscious idea of a goal or a good.
So we can't really will something without using reason to define it first.
That's Green's point. We can't act intentionally without reason formulating the object of our will.
And this ability, this determination of will by reason, that's what he calls moral freedom, autonomy.
Yes. If we use reason to determine our will, we are, in a deep sense, determining ourselves. We're becoming authors of our own lives, not just puppets of desire.
And what should we will, according to Green?
Well, he argued our understanding of moral value evolves. Humanity gradually moves from obeying rules out of fear or habit towards obeying, because we understand, through reason, that these rules are part of a rational moral order. We recognize we ought to obey.
So moving from external compulsion to internal reasoned assent. That's the act of moral freedom.
Exactly. The truly moral person, for Green, is the one who embraces this rational capacity. They see that their completeness, their realization of an idea of perfection, comes from aligning their individual will with these rational ethical rules.
So just living for petty pleasures, the pig-satisfied life.
Is sacrificing this fundamental moral autonomy. Freedom, in Green's positive sense, isn't just being left alone. It's the active choice to subordinate your will to rational, moral rules that you understand and make your own.
So like Mill, Green sees liberty, now identified with this rational moral conduct, as the highest value, tied to moral development.
Very much so. Green's realization of an idea of perfection echoes Mill's progressive development. And he'd agree with Mill that those without the right training or experience won't fully grasp this higher form of freedom.
But Green was more explicit in naming it. The source says he cloned positive freedom.
Yes, he deliberately contrasted it with negative liberty, the classical liberal idea from Hobbes and the utilitarians. Negative liberty is just freedom from interference.
He left alone.
Right. Positive freedom, for Green, is more than that. It's a positive power or capacity of doing or enjoying something worth doing or enjoying. And worth doing or enjoying always implies, for Green, something contributing to moral development, your own or others. It's freedom to achieve a moral purpose.
And this positive view of freedom required a different view of society, too, not just a collection of individuals.
Absolutely. If humans are rational and moral beings who develop socially, then society can't just be an artificial contract. For Green, society is an organic structure, this complex web of traditions, laws, institutions that binds people together into a larger ethical whole. It shapes who we are.
And this structure itself reflects moral progress.
Yes, he argued it constitutes the moral progress of mankind. Our institutions, marriage, property, the state, embodies our evolving moral understanding. As we progress morally, our institutions improve. Which is why, for Green, liberal democracy isn't just more efficient, it's morally superior because it embodies higher ideals like equality and rational participation.
And it works both ways. Participating in institutions helps us internalize their moral ideas.
Exactly. By acting within these structures, we absorb their values. Like using democratic processes, voting, debating helps you internalize the value of free opinion, not just as a right, but as essential for rational choice and autonomy. This internalization is that conformity of will to reason Green talked about. You come to actively will the good because you understand its rational basis.
This led Green to rethink the whole theory of rights, didn't it? A cornerstone of liberalism.
Radically revised it. Rights for Green aren't pre-social natural rights, nor just calculations of utility. They are fundamentally social, like Burke argued. In Green's words, it is only within society that there can be such a thing as a right.
So rights come from the community.
Their claims recognized and guaranteed by the community based on what the community understands is needed for its members to flourish morally.
Yeah.
They're prescriptive, evolving within society.
Now, that sounds like it could diminish individual rights. Was he saying rights are just whatever society decides?
That's a crucial clarification. No, Green wasn't saying that. He was still deeply committed to expanding individual liberty, especially intellectual and political freedom, because he saw those as essential for developing moral reason.
Okay.
But his social theory does mean that any claim to a right is inherently social. It has to recognize others' rights and contribute to the overall social good, the better being of all, meaning the moral progress of everyone.
And he applied this most significantly to property rights.
Yes, a key liberal right. For Green, property is a social right granted by society. Its justification is an absolute ownership, but whether it helps individuals develop moral capacities, responsibility, foresight, self-control, and contributes to that better being of all, ideally owning property is a moral exercise.
But here, the source says, was the massive problem Green saw in late 19th century industrial capitalism.
Exactly. The legal right to property, as it existed, was actually destroying the social reality and moral purpose of property for the vast majority of the working class.
And also,
Because workers owned basically nothing but their labor power, which they had to sell just to survive. They were, as Green powerfully put it, effectively denied rights of property altogether in any meaningful sense. They couldn't use property as a permanent apparatus for carrying out a plan of life or develop those ethical skills property was supposed to foster.
so the legal freedom to own meant nothing if the economic reality prevented you from actually owning anything significant?
Precisely. The capitalists and middle class could accumulate property and maybe develop those virtues, but the workers were shut out from the very conditions needed for their moral freedom and development, according to Green's theory.
And Green's solution to this is where modern liberalism really takes shape. The positive state.
Yes, this is the foundation. He argued the state has a positive responsibility to intervene, to reshape society and the economy so that the distribution of property and other goods allows all citizens to share in the benefits needed for their moral development.
So the state has to step in, legislate, Regulate.
Yes, take positive steps to prevent excessive wealth concentration. Create conditions where everyone can realistically acquire enough property to live a morally purposeful life and gain those ethical skills.
And he applied this logic beyond property too. Education, public health.
State-supported mass education, public health initiatives, other ventures aimed at creating the social and economic soil where the community's moral and intellectual life could actually grow.
So this makes Green the key advocate for the positive state, contrasting with the classical liberal negative state that just protects rights and enforces contracts.
Exactly, and the logic flows directly from his definition of freedom. If liberty is positive, the capacity to achieve moral purposes, then the state logically gains a positive role in structuring society to enable everyone to pursue those purposes.
But it's really important to stress, Green was still a liberal, right? The individual remained the focus.
Absolutely a vital point. The individual's moral development and autonomy were still paramount. He strongly rejected the idea that the state should legislate morality directly or try to force people to be free in some specific way, unlike, say, Rousseau, perhaps.
So the state's positive role is limited.
Strictly limited, in Green's view, to removing obstacles to moral freedom. Things like extreme poverty, ignorance, bad health, exploitation. If the state went beyond removing obstacles and tried to dictate moral outcomes, he argued it would defeat its own object. It would crush the spontaneous, self-chosen nature of moral action, which is freedom.
So he keeps the ideal of the free individual and limited government, but redefines the limits. Limited by purpose, removing obstacles, rather than just scope.
That's a good way to put it. Liberal democracy is still the ideal. Private property is reaffirmed, but modified to serve its social purpose and ensure real rights and moral benefits for everyone, not just a few.
So what's the upshot? Modern liberalism, born from Green and the Oxford idealists, developed by people like Hobhouse and Dewey, this became the theoretical justification for the modern welfare state.
Pretty much. It provided the intellectual framework. Though, as the source notes, the practical implementation was slower in the U.S., where classical liberal ideas held sway longer.
And this history helps explain why U.S. political labels can be confusing. Conservatives often sound like classical liberals, while liberals are modern liberals.
Exactly. The U.S. debate is often an argument between these earlier and later versions of liberalism itself.
Okay, let's take a step back. Looking from our perspective now, how do we assess modern liberalism? What are its strengths and weaknesses?
Well, on the plus side, the source points out some clear theoretical advantages over the older classical liberalism.
Such as?
First, a much richer, more realistic understanding of human psychology, moving beyond just pleasure pain to include reason, moral purpose, self-development. Second, a more realistic view of society, not just isolated atoms, but an organic structure of traditions and institutions that shapes us, a view largely backed up by modern social science.
And crucially, it legitimized the positive state.
Yes, that provided the necessary theoretical tools to even think about tackling the huge social and economic problems thrown up by industrial capitalism, poverty, inequality, slums things the negative state just wasn't equipped to handle. Modern liberalism allowed for collective action and reform.
So definite strengths. But what about the negative side? The problems, the critiques?
Well, one big issue is its ambiguity. Green's idealism is complex, and his followers took his ideas in different directions. Some stressed state rights, others pushed towards more socialist conclusions about property.
Suggesting maybe a lack of clarity at its core. A tension between the individual focus of liberalism and the idealist philosophy.
Perhaps. Critics argue classical liberalism, for all its faults, was clearer on the roles of state and individual.
And practically, has modern liberalism actually solved the problems Tocqueville worried about? Majority tyranny, conformity?
Well, critics argue it hasn't, and might have even contributed to them. Public opinion is still incredibly powerful, often homogenizing, just as Tocqueville and Mill feared.
And echoing Mill's worry. Have the very reforms meant to help mass education, welfare state, regulation sometimes backfired?
Some argue yes, that they've contributed to cultural homogenization, a sameness of opinion and experience, far beyond what Mill imagined. That quote about everyone reading, listening, seeing the same things feels very relevant today.
And the modern state hasn't been great at regulating the private forces of homogenization either. Media, advertising.
Largely ineffective, many would say, which reinforces that common, often superficial public opinion Mill feared mass communications might create.
Which leads to another big question. Has the welfare state itself become a threat to autonomy, the very thing Green wanted it to support?
That's a major line of criticism. Does dependence on government erode individual initiative? Does the state taking over functions previously handled by families, communities, voluntary groups actually weaken that crucial associational life Tocqueville saw as a buffer?
Destroying the buffers between the individual and the central state.
That's the fear, that private and local groups decline when the central bureaucracy does their job.
Leading ultimately back to Tocqueville's nightmare scenario.
The ultimate fear for these critics, yes. A slow slide into that willing enslavement to a benevolent, all-powerful bureaucratic despotism, accepted by people, ironically, for the sake of equality and security within democracy.
There's also that critique about an elitist social policy street, the do-getters.
Yeah, the argument that some liberals, maybe unconsciously channeling Bentham, believe too much in social engineering by experts, blurring the line between removing obstacles and manipulative intervention, telling people what's good for them.
And even deeper, some argue liberal ideas themselves, like from On Liberty, have been distorted.
Right, the idea that everyone has a right to their opinion gets twisted into meaning all opinions are equally valid, so the hard work of distinguishing true from false, better from worse, gets abandoned.
Which leads not to Mill's goal of progressive development, but maybe moral chaos, where anything goes.
That's the critique, that it mirrors the kind of intellectual anarchy Plato feared in democracy. The source quotes this directly: failure to evaluate opinions leads to moral confusion, not progress.
So all these criticisms suggest a potential breakdown in modern liberalism's internal consistency when facing today's world.
That's what the critics argue. The lines between state and individual, different kinds of rights, have become blurred. This theoretical confusion leads to practical results that sometimes seem to contradict liberalism's own goals.
And the reason for this confusion might just be the sheer scale and complexity of modern problems.
Very likely. Industrial capitalism, globalization, technology, environmental crises. Balancing individual autonomy with the need for state action to tackle these massive issues is incredibly hard. Maybe impossible to do with perfect theoretical neatness.
And historically, when a theory starts to lose coherence,
it often means it's struggling to fit reality. It gets stretched, modified, until the original premises don't quite hold, which raises that huge question. Can liberalism be revised again for the 21st century? Or is it reaching its limits? Remember, Marx thought it was finished over a century ago.
So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, despite all the criticisms and the real challenges it faces now, you absolutely cannot deny the profound importance of the liberal tradition in the West, and really globally.
Yeah, its core ideals have been transformative.
Absolutely. The inherent worth of the individual, basic human equality, political participation, free thought, free speech, limited government, even as its scope changed. Liberalism wasn't just theory. It drove massive political and social reforms, expanded freedoms enormously.
You could almost argue its basic ideals have kind of transcended the specific theories, become fundamental principles for any decent society.
That's what the source suggests, yeah. A kind of wisdom of the ages, representing core insights about how humans should live together.
Which leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Given all these challenges, the ones Tocqueville and Mill saw way back then, and the ones still plaguing liberal democracies today, homogenization, fragmented discourse, the state power versus individual autonomy balancing act.
Can these centuries-old liberal ideas really provide the answers we need now? Or are we watching a tradition that has to fundamentally transform itself yet again? Or maybe even give way to something new entirely?
Something to definitely keep thinking about.